Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive Perspective, a show in which we try to profile those people who are often censored by mainstream, I would say. That's a subtle way of putting it. Mainstream media seems to have its selection of people that it likes to put on, and it likes to cancel those who often tell the truth. Well, today we have joining us a real journalist, not one of those ones which parrots out whatever one establishment or another says. Vanessa Beeley is with us online from Lebanon. Vanessa is a journalist who's worked out in Syria since 2013 and, of course, has been a first-hand witness to one of the most cataclysmic changes in West Asia in recent times, the war on Syria, conducted ostensibly by Takfiri terrorist groups, but actually sponsored and funded and perhaps fully backed by the Western establishment, in particular also perhaps MI6, the CIA, and just about every other usual suspect in these scenarios. Why was Britain so involved in trying to oust Assad? What's been the outcome? Why have we now got Britain and the West openly cavorting with a man who is essentially Al-Qaeda, ISIS, all combined, and now he's been given a makeover by, it seems, the British intelligence services themselves? We're going to unearth this and far more in the upcoming interview. Welcome to the show, Vanessa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me on. It's been a while. We've been trying to organise it.
Yeah, well, we finally got there, and I'm intrigued by, firstly, focusing on the article you did for UK Column, and it was a fascinating piece where you begin actually by setting the context being the Sykes-Picot clandestine carving up of West Asia. And from there, of course, the story continues. And many people don't know the context of Syria, and often they take sides or completely are oblivious and buy into whatever mainstream media tells them. Just tell us a little bit about the story of Syria from that point, and we'll fast forward it to Ahmed al-Shara fashioned from Al-Julani by the end of the show, at least. So please, if you could just give us an overview on Syria.
Well, yeah, I mean, basically the Sykes-Picot Treaty was a secret treaty designed or orchestrated by the French and the British to carve up, as you said, the Middle East. Of course, also it was a pre-runner to the Balfour Treaty, which effectively brought in the Zionist project into Palestine to occupy the territory there, but also to drive a wedge between, for example, Egypt and Syria, and to prevent any kind of pan-Arabist deal between the two countries that would, of course, eventually have prevented resource grab, allowed those countries to have access to their own resources, and to basically benefit from their own resources and their sovereignty in the region. Britain and France, as the then colonial powers, of course, didn't want that to happen. And so they basically carved the Middle East up into spheres of influence between them.
Well, what was fascinating in your article was something, of course, one was suspicious of when you looked at what was going on in Syria, especially since 2012 onwards. But the Blair-Bush connection you particularly focused in on. What was Tony Blair and George Bush's involvement in Syria? How did you focus on that as perhaps the actual beginning of the current raising to power of Al-Qaeda in Syria?
Well, I mean, basically, the Bush-Blair relationship, of course, led both countries to the totally pre-orchestrated and unlawful war against Iraq based on the narrative of weapons of mass destruction. And that then led to the so-called war on terror, which, of course, as John Pilger described it, was the war of terror. The years after the launch of the war on terror, of course, terror has grown exponentially across the region, in particular fostered by the West. And basically, post 9/11, what Blair and Bush were discussing in their communications, which were revealed by the Chilcot inquiry into the war on Iraq, was that they were basically trying to create a different kind of relationship with Syria to avoid going to war, to topple the Syrian government. So they were hoping that they could persuade President Assad, Bashar al-Assad, to divorce from the resistance factions inside Syria and in the region. So that included the Palestinian resistance, Hamas, and Hezbollah, and to relinquish any solidarity with the Palestinian cause. And of course, President Assad refused to do so. He also refused a number of other terms of the agreement that Blair and Bush were trying to push forward. And at that time, of course, Blair in particular was actually courting President Assad. In 2002, he recommended President Assad for a knighthood. So that, shows the degree to which Blair was actually trying to bring Syria on board. And why is that important? Because Syria is the central hub. It's the land bridge between Iran and Palestine, and it's the spine of the resistance axis that runs from Palestine through Lebanon, Syria, into Iraq, and then Yemen and Iran.
So essentially, Blair and Bush were plotting to bring back some kind of order to the Sykes-Picot boundaries in a way. That sounds like what the objective was. There was something called clean break, I think, was also mentioned. What was clean break about? And was it that they just wanted to regain the hold on West Asia, given that the axis of resistance, led by Islamic Republic of Iran, but arguably, was actually wresting power from the Western agencies out there?
Well, I mean, basically what happened from the clean break doctrine onwards. So the clean break was a CIA paper written in 1996 at the behest of Benjamin Netanyahu, who of course is leading the genocide against Palestinians and the occupation of Lebanese and Syrian territory. And the clean break doctrine was a strategy for the future, for the new future of Israel. And that basically involved the destabilization of Syria through Iraq. And so what happened then is that led us forward to the 9/11 event and then the global war on terror, which brought down the countries that were perceived to be a threat to Israeli national security. And those wars, of course, were waged by the UK and the US, who have a vested interest in keeping Israel's security intact in the region. And it was stated at the time that all roads to Damascus go through Baghdad. So it was therefore noted in the clean break doctrine that it was important to topple Iraq first, impose US bases in Iraq to increase the feeling of insecurity in Syria, and then, if necessary, to bring down the government in Syria.
So once they set off in this direction, it seems it must have been happening around the turn of the century. It took till 2012 to actually begin to realize the practical operations on the ground. So they gave it some time to get things done by buying off Assad. He didn't buy into that. And of course, then they unleashed. There was a fascinating interview back in about 2012 or 13 in which the French foreign minister confirms this. So it's not just conspiracy theory. I mean, I think it was the foreign minister's Roland who actually highlighted an objection by the French government to MI6 and the establishment preparing the Ikhwan al-Muslimin of Syria, who were being prepared presumably both in Syria and in Turkey. So very early on, there seems to be evidence that actually they weren't in total agreement. The French, it seemed, weren't either getting their cut of the action or didn't agree with the British plan, and it did get exposed at that time. What do you know about that particular aspect?
I mean, in the region, there has always been a degree of competition, let's say, between France and Britain. Roland Dumas, yes, he exposed in 2013. Then in 2009, he was approached by British officials who then told him, we're preparing the armed militants, to lead an insurgence against the Syrian government because basically they're not coming on board with our requirements. But if you also go back to 2006, there was a headline in, I think, then Time magazine, Syria in Bush's crosshairs, and that also was describing the fact that the US would be involved in arming and funding insurgents in Syria. And in 2005, there was an interview with President Assad by Christiane Amanpour, in which he openly talked about the potential for regime change.
And Jake Sullivan, of course, was caught red-handed with that infamous email to Hillary Clinton, in which he said Al-Qaeda in Syria is on our side. So it's pretty irrefutable that the deep state, the Western deep state, the Zionist Western deep state, was up to its ear rolls in conspiracies and regime change efforts. They cannot deny it, but yet still today, what we're finding is this kind of ignorance and denial. And I find that particularly also amongst the Muslims. So the people of West Asia are still slightly confused about what's gone on, because part of this plan was obviously also the Arab kings, the monarchs, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, all of them had an interest in this, and indeed, arguably, well, not arguably, it can be evidence that the money trails go back through agencies fronted by Qatar, or agencies that were fronting Qatar's sort of funding into this. So it seems that the conspiracy and the alliance was broader than just the Western powers. What was the role of the Arab monarchs in all this?
Well, actually, going back to the clean break doctrine, it's stated very clearly that Israel would harness Turkey and particularly Jordan to enable this destabilization of Syria. Jordan, because of course it has long had designs on retaking territory that it perceived to belong to the Hashemite kingdom in Syria. And of course, for Erdogan, it's the neo-Ottoman designs on securing northern Syria, in particular the industrial capital of Aleppo, and basically annexing the entire northern tract of territory in Syria to prevent the Kurdish establishment of any kind of autonomous entity on the border with Turkey. And the Gulf states, I mean, yes, you mentioned Qatar. Qatar, of course, is let's say, the incubator of the Muslim Brotherhood, which were effectively also created by the British and Egypt in the late 1920s. So again, it's an organization which has been weaponized by the imperialist powers, particularly in Syria, going back to the late 1970s, the so-called Hama massacre, which in fact was preceded by Muslim Brotherhood massacres, both of civilians and of military car bombs, suicide bombs, the assassination of the army cadets at the college in Aleppo, where they killed not only Shia and Alawite cadets, but they also murdered the Sunni Muslim cadets that wouldn't abandon their comrades. And so therefore, since 1946 onwards, actually, so since Syria's, if you like, liberation from French mandate in 1946, there have been a series of clandestine operations against Syria, either to secure regime change, to divorce them from the then Soviet Union or later from Russia. And that is a particular desire of the British in Syria to get Russia out. That's historically always been one of their goals in Syria, is to prevent Russia from having a foothold in the middle of the region.
Of course, there is an argument to say that President Assad was a dictator. He was a bad guy. He was treating the Syrian people terribly. This is a narrative that comes from a lot of what I would describe as the Takfiri, Western-linked freedom fighters, they'd like to put them, but they clearly were people involved in an insurgency that now is pretty pretty much guaranteed to have been a Western-sponsored one. But they say that, well, we were justified because we were liberating the Syrian people, and the Syrian people wanted us liberated. You were there since 2013 or so. To what extent is that true? Because the alternative to this, I mean, I'm hearing is Assad ran a very competent Syria, which was very comfortable, relatively affluent, and relatively stable. So these kinds of narratives, which we hear all the time coming from Western media agencies of Assad the butcher, is there any real truth in that?
I mean, prior to 2011, there is actually a very sort of academic book written by US academic David Lash, who shadowed Assad for at least a year. And I think it's called The New Line of Damascus from memory. But it's worth reading that to get a glimpse of how Assad was perceived prior to 2011, when the manufactured insurgents and so-called peaceful protests began, that were not remotely peaceful. The largest number of casualties were among the security forces and the police and the army that were not allowed to carry weapons for the first 6 months. And I think the greatest criticism that is levied at President Assad from 2011 onwards by the Syrian people. And you're right. I mean, from 2016, I spent extensive time in Syria. 2013, I started to really report on what was going on. Most people were saying he's not tough enough. He's not his father. He's not Hafez al-Assad. He wasn't tough enough. He gave them too many chances. He tried to bring in too many reforms. He tried to appease them rather than actually crack down on what was going on and to deal with it much more preemptively than he did. So he was actually considered by the majority of the people in Syria to be too soft towards the Takfiri, as you said, the Takfiri elements that were being funded by the West, the Gulf states, and by Israel to effectively overthrow the government and to take Syria back to the Dark Ages, which is what we're now seeing under, as you mentioned, Mohammed Al-Julani, who was initially with ISIS, and then he formed Al-Qaeda in Syria with other members of his now regime in Damascus, who's now conducting mass ethnic cleansing programs against all ethnic minorities inside Syria. That wasn't happening for the last 14 years.
Well, it does seem as though, again, if we go to the trigger, which the Western journalists certainly focus on, i.e. the uprising, the Arab Spring was kind of taking place. And again, that's very much recognized, I think, by anybody who's got any real credentials in journalism to be a PSYOP, a Zio-imperialist Western PSYOP in the first place, the whole Arab Spring thing. But actually in Syria, it was perhaps one of the real targets where they really wanted to create this kind of regime change, not because they wanted Arab liberation or freedom, but because they wanted to overthrow Assad. They'd made their mind up. But how they did it is interesting, because there were rumors that actually when Assad did send his troops in to quell some local discontent, I think it was in Dara perhaps, and they weren't really that hard on them. They went into the area, but they were then targeted by snipers and by armed parties, which then exacerbated the whole problem. And the reaction then that Assad gave to that seems to have been the cue for triggering and kickstarting an entire range of insurgents who were ready for this, and before you knew it, you had this kind of whole of Syria up in flames. Is that a reliable version that I picked up, or what's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, basically, a lot of the protests were paid protests at the time, and they were relatively small. And of course, what was being ignored in Western media, particularly, were the marches and demonstrations on the streets in support of Assad that were in their tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. And in fact, I think it was journalist Jonathan Steele in 2012 that wrote for The Guardian one of the last articles that he wrote for them that I'm aware of, where he said what people don't understand is that even Poles in Qatar and in what can be perceived as enemy countries are saying that he has a huge or a significant majority and popularity inside Syria. And so all of this, Ali Hashem at the time, working for Al Jazeera, another journalist, resigned because he was being censored on talking about the armed groups that were coming in from Jordan and the weapons that were flowing in from Jordan as well to the insurgents in the south. And of course, from the north, from Libya through Turkey into northern Syria. And Turkey had been training these Takfiri forces inside Turkey prior to 2011.
So that kind of helps, again, put a little bit of flesh on what actually went on, because what we saw here on Western media was then a portrayal of Assad as being a kind of a chemical Ali-style character, you know, the one from Iraq who was made famous during the Iraq War, that he was barrel bombing his own people. He had chemical weapons. And there was no stone left unturned, it seemed, by Western-backed propaganda. We were seeing fake videos being made of supposed Assad forces, you know, harming individuals in Syria. It was quite extraordinary. It was almost like this kind of make-believe version of what was going on that was being filmed live. And they were actually caught. A lot of journalists and filmmakers were indeed caught. So that seemed like we'd entered a new kind of coverage of war as well, because I've got to bring the media into this. Western media's role in propagating these kinds of lies or suppressing that truth, or not even really having access to news about the war, which was independent, but relying wholly and solely on I guess, what they were getting from governments. That seems to be a trend which now is almost actually written in stone. And all of these state-sponsored government media agencies from the West, as well as the corporate Zionist-controlled ones, are following suit. What role did Syria have in actually creating this new kind of fake journalism?
I mean, I think the propaganda war against Syria was off the scale. I mean, up until 2013, the West had embedded what they called, this is where the term citizen journalist sort of arrived at iconization value for the West and media, because they relied entirely on effectively assets that were embedded with the armed groups in the various areas where they occupied urban areas of the main cities in Syria. And what those citizen journalists were doing were uploading their footage to a platform called Bambuser. And then basically people like CNN and Channel 4 and BBC and all of them were taking their footage from there. But what was actually uncovered by a filmmaker in Syria was they were only taking the section that was suitable for airing. They were ignoring the footage where it was clear that whichever citizen journalist, whether it was Dani Abdul Dayem or Rami Jara at the time, were faking the news footage. And of course, this was demonstrated, particularly with Dani Abdul Dayem on a report in Homs, and he was shown to have faked the entire report and even included fake gunfire, fake shelling, etc. And so they were largely exposed. So 2013 onwards, it was MI6 that basically brought in the organization known as the White Helmets that were established in Turkey and Jordan by a former British military intelligence operative, and also funded by the CIA and by Qatar and so on. And the White Helmets then basically were embedded with Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all of the sort of trickle-down armed groups that were working under the Al-Qaeda umbrella. And were tasked with corroborating foreign policy for the West and the entire alliance, which of course was regime change. So the White Helmets were the ones who effectively staged and produced the chemical weapon attacks from 2013 onwards, which of course included Ghouta, and then 2017 Khan Shaykhun, and finally 2018 in Douma in the suburbs of Damascus.
And of course, I can't help but mention the fact that other institutions like the watchdogs for chemical warfare, etc., all weighed in on this as well. And it does seem to be another consistent trend that the likes of the AIEA, the atomic agencies, these chemical agencies, the international agencies, who at that time began to weigh in on the side of Zio-Western propaganda, now in Gaza are being totally exposed because, again, we can see the playbook that was rolled out in Syria, perhaps also in Yemen, the way those wars were treated and the way the cover-up happened. It seems that there's a connection between the politicians, the intelligence services, the media, as well as these supposed international agencies which are meant to be stopping war or genuinely trying to tell us the truth. Is it now the case that we really must be cautious about believing anything that the international agencies say, even in Gaza or even Syria today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing I would say is that the West has very recently admitted that they have almost no intelligence on Yemen. So whatever exercises they tried to repeat in Yemen failed dismally. And that includes, of course, the involvement of former chief of staff for Tony Blair, who we've talked about as being very much the architect of the final toppling of the Assad government in Syria alongside George W. Bush. His chief of staff was Jonathan Powell in 2011. He established the organization Intermediate that was then proven to have ties to the CIA, to the MI6, to the SIS, to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and was effectively tasked with supplying intelligence on what was going on inside Syria, but also the grooming of Al-Julani. This is now very well documented, but also going back to 2020 and the release of documents from the UK Foreign Office showing the extent to which they had basically driven the narratives through captured media organizations like the BBC and Channel 4 and many others within the legacy media in the UK to basically identify witnesses, to have the citizen journalists on the ground, to create this entire media complex that would run the narratives from inside Syria in order to, as I've said before, to corroborate their foreign policy, which was to topple the Syrian government. And so therefore, we have to look upon the media as being nothing more than an extension of government policy and of intelligence operations in their respective countries. And as long as people bear that in mind when they're looking at the information that's coming out, so even if it is information that is useful, why is it being released now? Why is this timing important? What are they trying to distract us from? So instead of taking it at face value, we have to question everything that comes out of legacy media, basically.
Well, I've also seen that on Mint Press News there was a interview with a man from Mossad who actually totally admitted that they literally can invent reality, that they can create entire realities based on his. I think his discussion was based on those pager bombs, that mass terror act which Israel carried out in Lebanon only recently, which should frighten people because that's the first time you could literally say they justified state-sponsored terror on a mass level. We get told to walk out and demonstrate against ISIS terrorism in any Western capital, etc. And even the ministers and the leaders of the world are told to turn out. When it comes to a mass terror operation like that, actually there was nothing from Western media. Another sign that we've got to really be careful. But I mean, just continuing, I think in terms of conclusions, it's all culminated now with essentially Al-Qaeda, a well-known head-chopping, butchering, takfiri, organization, nurtured clearly by the West, in actually now running Syria. And what we're seeing is Ahmed al-Shara, Mr. Julani, is welcoming Israel into into Syria. He's actually literally annexing large parts of Syria without a single shot being fired against the Israelis. He's also creating a circumstance where the French could begin to break Syria apart by saying perhaps the Alawites need their own state, and that would be a way of fragmenting that part. And of course, we know in the northeast, the Turks want the Kurdish territories, and they also already control most of northern Syria. So essentially, between the Arabs, the Turks, the French, the British, and the Americans, Syria is essentially no more. It's been balkanized, basically.
Well, and the Russians, because the Russians are consolidating their base in the coastal area in Khaimimim, Tartus, in collaboration with Israel, that has basically lobbied with the US to allow them to remain. And I think that is one reason that the British are now building a presence in Syria. Jonathan Powell has been visiting since Damascus fell. There are British private military contractors operating inside Syria again immediately after Damascus fell. I'm told that there are British military operatives and British intelligence operatives swarming all over Damascus at the moment. They're in most of the big hotels there. So clearly Britain sees an opportunity now to re-embed itself in the region, to take control of the military, because they've sent in military attaches. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith has been there very recently having discussions with the so-called Minister of Defense, who of course is also former Al-Qaeda, talking about cooperation on military and defense, which of course is going to serve Israel perfectly. Because having the British in charge of any military inside Syria means that it's not going to be a threat to Israel. And of course, going back to Blair and Bush and clean break, that was the goal, was to secure Israel's national security now and for the future. And I think, the normalization with Israel is a big part of the push by both the UK and the US. Trump is offering to lift sanctions provided Julani gives assurances that Syria will normalize with Israel pretty soon, because he's only lifted the sanctions for 180 days, which is kind of, typical Trump sleight of hand, in the sense that he's not really going to give any concessions. But who's going to come and invest in Syria, knowing that potentially the sanctions are going to be back on in 180 days? So this is all about security of Israel, but also the re-entry of France and Britain into the region. France already has renewed its contract for Latakia port, promising to invest in its expansion and development over the next 30 years. And it's also investing in dry ports in central Syria. And as I said, the British are expanding their intelligence and military presence in Syria. What will happen to Julani in the near and long-term future, I have no idea. I don't think he's going to be around for very long, because it's pretty much an untenable position. He's been conducting ethnic cleansing, as I said, against any minorities that are not going to comply with the Takfiri project, and that includes Sunni Muslims that don't agree with his ideology. But he's also rubbing his own supporters up the wrong way. The foreign mercenaries, the more extremist factions like ISIS and so on are turning against him, because he's not upholding the whole caliphate vision that he sold them. Trump is putting pressure on him to kick out the foreign terrorists. He can't do that because that's 40% of his armed forces that are keeping him in power. He also can't do it because he's made all sorts of promises to them of citizenship and housing and powerful positions within government and military.
Where does this leave the axis of resistance? Because, of course, this whole plan to bring back a new kind of Sykes-Picot kind of scenario was primarily to push out that gathering of a kind of what some described as a sheer crescent, or actually it was less of a sheer crescent, but more of a kind of a landmass stretching from Iran through to Lebanon, which was looking for its sovereignty and independence from Zionist Western imperialism. Where does it leave the resistance now?
Well, I mean, of course, what the intention was to fragment and isolate the resistance. So they've tried to isolate Palestine. They've tried to isolate Hezbollah. They've clearly isolated Syria, and they've cut the land bridge from Iraq in particular, but also from Iran to Lebanon and Palestine. So what they've been trying to do is to isolate the resistance into their nation states and to break the connections that they had both for arms delivery, arms production, because Syria was producing a lot of the arms that were being sent to Palestine and to Lebanon to enable the resistance to fight back against the Zionist tyranny, of course. And so now what you have are isolated resistance factions within their own nation states. But I don't think it's going to remain like that. I think what you're seeing now is Yemen coming to the fore. Al-Houthi is speaking very much for the resistance axis in its entirety. And Yemen is very successfully, while adhering to the Geneva Convention on Genocide, is blockading the Red Sea and is now creating a no-fly zone over Israel. I mean, how many airlines have now cancelled their flights into Ben Gurion Airport because of the threat of Yemeni missiles? And so I think we're seeing, let's say, a withdrawal of the resistance to regroup and reorganize. But I certainly don't think you've seen the end of it. Even from Syria, there's something like 80,000 to 100,000 Syrian army soldiers that have dispersed themselves into the various resistance factions in neighboring countries and who have been preparing for whatever will come in the future. I don't know what the plans are, but it's certainly not dead. It's certainly not gone. Syria is obviously going to have to make some concessions for now under Julani, which most Syrians would not agree with and would not want to happen. Syrians right now are very traumatized by what has gone on. But I don't think that lasts long. If you look at Syria's history, it's a history of resistance. It's a history of rejection of colonialism. And I think that will return at some point. I'm not quite sure when or how.
Well, it does seem that when the Arab government started engaging with Assad, it does seem as though it's a strong likelihood that many people, maybe unknown to Assad, within his establishment, generals and various others, did get bought off because the way the Syrian army collapsed, that was over 200,000 soldiers who had fought for maybe 13, 14 years prior to that, who collapsed within a matter of 2-3 weeks. Now, that can't happen unless there was a complete or deliberate collapse of the high command within the Syrian military. And that seems that there may well have been an entire conspiracy against Assad to actually exercise this. Again, I'm speculating. You'll know better than I will. But, that collapse, it probably is important to ask the question, why did it collapse so rapidly?
I think there were a number of reasons. I think from 2020 onwards, the Trump administration had brought in the Caesar sanctions deliberately to increase the economic depression, the lack of dignity, the lack of ability to restore infrastructure, including medical, health, oil. Syria was deprived. It was energy deprived. It was food deprived. It was completely under siege. And then the Caesar sanctions basically prevented any country coming to its assistance. So from 2020 onwards, Syria sort of did spiral economically out of control. And I would agree that the power, instead of being centralized, was being spread out across too many areas, and it was no longer under the control, in my opinion, from what I saw and heard, of the government itself. The army was to some degree neglected, so therefore it was demoralized. But I would argue that the Syrian army did not really surrender. They were put in a position where the commanding officers were taken off the field by chief of staff, who was, in my opinion, part of the betrayal. And the soldiers were left without communication and without command. And at the same time, I think Russia had reached a point of frustration with President Assad because he had refused to negotiate with Erdogan. He wasn't moving fast enough towards the Gulf states, which I think was Russia's intention, to push him closer to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And so I do think a deal was done between the regional players, including Russia, Turkey, and Israel, and of course with Britain and the US in the background. To remove Assad. I think initially the idea was to remove him, but to let him stay for 6 months and to create a coalition government and to have a peaceful transition. At some point, that all went horribly wrong. And Assad was rushed out of Damascus, and Damascus fell in a matter of hours, which was a shock to all of us who were on the ground. We certainly didn't expect that.
And you were there.
And so, yes, I think you're right there. Yeah,
you had to escape yourself. How was that? How did it feel? What happened there?
Well, I think from the beginning, I mean, you said 2 to 3 weeks, but it was actually only, I think, about 10 days from the start of the attack on Aleppo to the fall of Damascus. And I think, I mean, I went to Hama and to Homs and to Tartus during the battles, and there was an awful lot of confusion. There was a complete information vacuum. There was no communication between command and the Syrian Arab Army. And what I was told afterwards was some brigades were being told to surrender, and then the neighboring brigades were not being told. So they were continuing fighting, and then suddenly realizing that they're isolated and surrounded, and they had no choice but to surrender. But I can tell you that certain pockets continued fighting even after Damascus fell. So I slightly defend the Syrian Arab Army when people say that they surrendered en masse. They didn't. It was a very confused picture. For me, as soon as the armed groups entered Damascus and surrounded my house, it became apparent that I had to leave. And I was very lucky. I had a very good driver who got me out through some pretty hairy moments to the border. And from there, a car came to pick me up from Lebanon and take me through the Lebanese border. But I had literally an hour to pack one bag and take one dog and leave a life that I'd considered would be my life far into the future. I wasn't intending to leave Syria.
And just finally, after that kind of harrowing experience, your final crystal ball prediction. I mean, one of the things that I've come across is the notion that Syria could well be used as a base to now get the Julani types, the Al-Qaeda types, all these ISIS chaps and the Turks, to actually also try and reinvade Iraq, as ISIS did, many years ago. Do you think there's any chance of Iraq also toppling in the same way?
I think Iraq is a different prospect because it's already, I don't want to say under the control of the US because it isn't, because there are very strong resistance factions within Iraq. But the government itself is largely working and collaborating with the United States. The United States, as described in the Clean Break Doctrine, has established its basis there. It has Iraqi Kurdistan, where, of course, the US is effectively in control both of Kurdistan itself, but also of the resources there. So you're really only talking the resistance factions that would stand in the way of any US-Israeli advance into Iraq, and they will do so. ISIS has already been deployed in Iraq for some years now and has been carrying out operations, and I think those will continue. But I think one thing that we do have to be aware of is that in 2015, and I mentioned that in the article, Julani was talking in an interview about the fact that the foreign Takfiris could be weaponized against Iran to unite with factions within Iran that would also sympathize with the Takfiri ideology and would be prepared to rise up within Iran to destabilize Iran from within. I'm not saying that Iran is not prepared for that, but I don't think we're going to see a conventional war with Iran. I think we're far more likely to see attempts to destabilize Iran from within, which of course is what we have been saying anyway for years. And then, of course, the loss of President Raisi and Abdul Hayyan was a huge blow to the Iran leadership. And I don't have any evidence for this, but my gut feeling is that it was not by accident that happened. And of course, that follows the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi Mohandes, the leader of the PMU factions in Iraq, by Trump back in 2020. So this has been a very long road towards isolation of Iran in the region. And that brings in Saudi Arabia, of course, that is the biggest competitor of Iran in the region. And that's one of the reasons that they were involved in the war against Syria.
Well, Vanessa Beeley, thank you so much. I've taken you pretty much on an entire journey across the Syrian and West Asian landscape, and you've been ever so gracious. And do keep safe out there. We know that Lebanon is still very much in the crosshairs of Israel, and indeed now the current regime in Syria, as well as, of course, the Zionist and wider alliance. But I wish you well, and thank you for sharing with us these kind of really fascinating and in-depth views, which I think often are just completely ignored in mainstream media. I'm sure we'll have you on again at some stage soon, and we bid you farewell. Thank you, and to the audience, constant, never-ending wars of terror, these forever wars. It seems as though they benefit the wealthy. Perhaps the parasite elite is what I might be able to call them, if I'm really honest. And they seem to constantly benefit in terms of corporate contracts. So they benefited from war and the sales of arms, and now they'll benefit from Syria in terms of its reconstruction and all those ports and all the trade that will go on. It seems as though they always win in any given war, and they're the ones who seem to have an interest in creating these wars. As for you, the public, me as a British citizen, what do I get out of these wars? Other than more immigrants coming into the country, because the Syrians who were displaced because of these wars, million maybe have ended up in Germany and beyond. Well, was it their fault? Are they here in the West now because of the fact that they want to get into Europe? Or was it because we went and decimated their societies, pillaged and their resources, created instability for our parasite moneylender elite? And as a result, we have to pay the price. And now we have people like Mr. Farage trying to win our votes on the back of immigrants and racist sort of policies, really just manipulating you to try and vote for him to do exactly what Keir Starmer has done, and probably what Rishi Sunak did, and going back to Tony Blair, who Vanessa very admirably and very, very professionally, I think, unveiled in terms of the involvement. When do we stop this cycle? That's the question. Is it something we want? Will our economics of the parasite elite be more important to us than our morality? And will at any stage the public in the West take responsibility for these forever wars and what we're causing around the world? That's for you to decide and for you to act on, perhaps, and for your conscience to perhaps dwell upon. Do like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you more of these great voices, real journalists, real independent voices that tell the truth. And again, my thanks to Vanessa Beeley. Until the next show, goodbye.